So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thanks everyone for joining. So for some of you which might be new to us, I think just want to go over what strong support is and, kind of what services and so on it provides, inshallah. So strong support is a peer support base for Muslims with unwanted same-sex lust or sexuality issues or gender identity issues. And we basically borne out the fact that there doesn't seem to be a lot of safe spaces for Muslims to discuss things around sex and sexuality. So this webinar, for example, is a good example where issues like this are sometimes considered too sensitive to discuss, or to kind of have an open or candid conversation on. In terms of the services that we provide, we have weekly support group. So one of which is on Thursdays, which I help run. And then we've got volunteers for a women's group and a men's group on Sundays. As well as that, we offer free first consultation. So we've spoken to about over 200 people so far who have accessed that service and free consultation call on Muslims who are struggling with their sexual identity. We also offer dedicated one-to-one coaching, and that's also available. And then the other thing that we provide is this webinars, which is free for everyone, and it's so we get the wider audience, the wider Muslim ummah can be more involved in this, inshallah. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Haidar with us this session. Dr. Haidar actually contacted us first, which was really nice. And it just goes to show that, there needs to be further conversation on these topics, because obviously these topics are something which are real for most of us. Obviously this webinar is intended for an adult audience, but there's definitely an Islamic standpoint, a Muslim standpoint, that there isn't something which Islam shies away from. So as strong support is based on Quranic principles, I'd just like to start by sharing some verses of the Quran. So the first one in chapter 30 is a very famous verse which talks about and of his signs, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, is that he created for you yourselves mates that you may find tranquility, لِتَسْكَنُوهُ إِلَيْهَا, and he placed between you mawaddata wa rahma, affection and mercy. Indeed, these are signs for people who tafakkur, people who give thought. Now again, this paints, again, positive messages of what that intimacy is. Now, of course, there'll be verses which will talk about the negative side of that, and how that power or that sexual power could be used in a darker form, or it can be something which could be more of a lustful state. So as we say same-sex lust, as we say shahwat. So the next verse you can see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Zayyinu lil nas, so beautified of the world's beauty is hubbu shahwat, so love of desires, of love of lusts. And in particular, what's mentioned here is of وَالنِّسَاءُ banin. So like the women and sons heaped of sums of gold and silver, branded horses, and so on. So these are kind of things which are beautified for us. Um, so in similarly, with a similar theme in the Quran. Now, this verses are very known. The first few verses of Surah Al-Mu'minun, uh, when Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says, "وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ." Illa, and that illa is very important, which just comes in illa alal azwajihim. So for, except for their couples, so for their wives or what their right hands possess. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes on further to say, for indeed they will not be blamed. So again, it almost gives the idea that, oh, okay, is sex always something which is out of bounds, it's bad, or we can't talk about it, it's a difficult topic. So again, in that relationship, actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying there is no blame in that relationship. Furthermore, and again, the ayah which is quite in Surah Al-Baqarah, which is quoted a lot of times, is nisa'ukum hursulakum. So they're sowing seed, or the women are place of cultivation. And again, this is a metaphor which is being used, and it's a very interesting metaphor to kind of delve into, of what that actually means when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says place of cultivation, and he says, so come to your place of cultivation however you wish, and put forth rightness for yourself. So again, there's that freedom of saying, in that relationship with your wife or with your married partner, there is that freedom, and it isn't something which the Quran is shying away from in terms of this topic, and neither is sex and a topic which the ahadith shy away from in general. So inshallah, we just wanted to give like an introduction for that in terms of the framework and like the lens of what we are. Obviously in this webinar, inshallah, we'd be looking at a psychoanalytical perspective, and especially seeing how Muslim communities are responding, or generally faith-based communities respond to the topic of sex, and what does a healthy sex and what does a negative sex energy look like, and inshallah we can explore that. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Haidar, and Dr. Haidar has very interesting, I would say, story, because when I spoke to him earlier, and I was like, burnout coach, what's a burnout coach? And I looked into this, and I was amazed at the great work that people in the medical profession are actually nowadays, when NHS is, for example, given a lot of credit for the work they're doing, but so many GPs or people working in healthcare anyone working in healthcare experiencing that burnout, and how common that is. And Dr. Haidar leads a podcast, which inshallah he can mention, where he interviews a lot of guests. And I think the recent guests at the moment have been around this theme of healthcare, and how really that we're distributing that. And I really recommend that as a podcast to look at, inshallah. It has quite a varied amount of speakers from different areas, business and health, fitness. There's a lot there. So yes, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Haidar. Um, Assalamu alaikum, doctor.
Salamun alaikum, Ali. How are you?
I'm good, alhamdulillah. Good to finally have you.
Yes. Congratulations on the new birth.
Yes, no, thank you.
The new Ali Jr.
Yeah, we're just saying if you hear any crying noises, then you know what that is.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that came into my mind was competition. You got competition now, mate. And this is something that will be I was going to say a big challenge for you, but inshallah be a big blessing. But this sort of competition for sexual energy is
Yeah,
quite profound for males.
absolutely.
Particularly for a newborn, and particularly if it's a boy as well. And with human beings, the ego is actually quite powerful. The ego kicks in, and because you've got an ego relationship with your ego, it's actually quite powerful. And you realize your ego from the age of probably about 3 or 4, and then the ego is very clever at maintaining that relationship. And in a sense, I mean, I'm sort of jumping in straight away now.
No, go. You're straight
Essentially,
into the psychosexual development of
yeah.
the
I
child.
mean, a bit before that, I mean, because your ego is so strong, it overpowers the intellect, until you reach a stage where the intellect is more powerful than the ego. And that tends to happen once you've experienced the detrimental effects of the ego power. So probably around the 30s and 40s, you realize that the intellect is actually a good thing. And then as you hit the 50s and 60s and 70s, you realize that actually the spiritual power or the psychic power is more powerful than the intellect. And you start letting go of the intellect. But that's as a sort of a side note.
When would you say we first experience our ego? What age?
That sort of separateness. So coming back to sex, essentially from a psychoanalytical point of view, sex is about pleasure. I mean, that's what it boils down to. And the first experiences of pleasure probably is when you're born and you have that skin to skin contact. Did they tell you to have
they said that. They said that skin. It's like when they actually have that on the there's an acronym I can't remember, and it's like hat on, this on, and then skin to skin, and that's the first thing they say as soon as the baby's born. You put them next to your skin.
Yeah, because the reality of things, you've got a fetus that's been cocooned in this lovely environment, which is warm. Everything's there, everything's been provided for it, and it's constantly being, the lovely word is validated, psychologically speaking, and reassured, but particularly if the mother's in a happy state, which is really important because, in terms of fetal development, it's really important to start before conception. We have a hadith saying that before conception, these are the kind of rituals you should do in order for the, the sperm and the sort of ovaries to be in an ideal state. And then they're conceived, and then they're in the fetus. So from that moment on, there's this constant reassurance and constant pleasure environment. And then all of a sudden, they're sort of shot out somewhere into something foreign that they've never experienced before. So they need that constant pleasurable experience, but constantly they're being exposed to trauma because they get the touch and it feels lovely, and then they get separated. And then they get, for example, the breast, and then they get separated. Then they experience the pain of the bowels, for example, and then they release it through the rectum. They get the unusual experience of having a full bladder, and then they experience it going through the genitals. So these are all bodily experiences that they go through, and they connect that with pleasure. So so the main areas of pleasure are the erogenous sites, which is the mouth, the skin, the anus and the genitalia. So these are very, very powerful pleasure-inducing areas, which we experience from such a young age. But I think once you go through a lot of traumas of separation, so you can only have some, I mean, if you have enough of the breast, for example, enough feeding, then you don't crave for more pleasure. If you have enough skin contact and it fills you, then you don't want more skin contact. You know, if your bowels are emptied, your bladders are emptied, then there isn't that need for more pleasure. So, you know, if
you're
something,
satisfied.
you're satisfied pleasure-wise, which is what, you know, the sort of the early sexual development talk about in the first 2 or 3 years. After that, then you sense that this isn't the whole story, because I get the pleasure, then it's gone. And then they realize that there is a separation between themselves and the pleasure. And that's when they develop the ego, which is around the age of 3, around that sort of ballpark figure in terms of the psychoanalytical thought. And then the ego finds out that actually pleasure is very powerful, and pleasure can create a structure on which to understand the universe or the surroundings. So pleasure becomes very, you know, a very powerful tool for the ego to use in order to exert itself. So that's why, you know, as a, which is why probably from the age of 2, we get these things called the terrible twos, where there is a kind of a conflict between the pleasure-seeking being and the ego developing. This is separation, is this sort of conflict between the, you know, the very primitive being and the development of the self and the development of the I-ness within you. And this is before any kind of social construct. So this is before you start building social constructs, you know, within your ego. You know, that comes at, you know, around 5 or 6 or 7. You start understanding that actually it's not just about my ego, which, you know, it's not just this narcissistic driven being. Actually, I'm within a social constraint. And that's when family comes in, or society comes in, or religion, or whatever kind of social construct that you're within starts exerting itself.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to say that the need for pleasure and, you know, the different organs, as you've said, are set for pleasure from birth, isn't it? So it's like it's a need. It's you know, and
as long as you're on this planet, you know, I mean, we say, as, you know, sort of weird psychoanalysts, is that your connection with the earth is through the pleasures and through sex. So that's your connection with earth. As long as you're living, you need that need for pleasure. And the greatest form of pleasure comes through, obviously there are other forms of pleasure, you know, food is sort of one of them, and but that tends to have more social constructs. But the basis of pleasure, of human pleasure, comes from sex, because it's such a pure form of pleasure. And, you know, it always brings a smile to people's faces, depending on, you know, have you developed on from that initial development of pleasure seeking activities. So people can regress. So when we talk about regression, so people regress from so if you're at the age of 7, you've sort of gone into the ego state, and then you're coming into the social construct state, you can regress back into the infantile state. Okay, so some people don't actually progress, they regress. You know, they fight against social constraints, or the environment that they're in doesn't have a social constraint. or a
Mm-hmm.
social structure.
Yeah.
That
So I
doesn't
guess,
develop.
yeah. So I guess at some point the child experiences some regulation or some socialization where they're expected to
Yeah. And then there's
behave.
dysregulation. Then
Mhm.
they can regress back. And then, some people have issues for example, they have complexes around the anus, for example, or anus stimulation or anal sex or sort of stuff like that.
Mhm.
And these different areas symbolize different things.
Mhm.
So the anus symbolizes control.
Mhm.
So there is a dysregulation of development. Instead of developing a normal sense of control, in other words, you realize that you're not in control, that there are other bigger controls that control you, and you have no control in that. And that's a normal development. An abnormal development is not accepting that control. And you have to control everything around you.
Mhm.
And there's a theory that they go on to develop dysregulation or complexes around the anal issues.
So are you saying there's like almost like a power dynamic which is at play here?
Well, there's always a power dynamic, and then people realize that because these powers are quite powerful, because they're so innate in all of us, this sort of pleasure world is so powerful. They use that in order to manipulate whatever they want to manipulate.
Mm.
And they realize that as well as a young age, because they see that these practices, whether it's sexual practices or other pleasure-seeking practices, has a desired effect for themselves. It tends to be ego-driven, because we're still in the ego here. We haven't moved on from the ego. It's not an intellectual issue. It's actually an existence issue. So the ego is driven by existence, still within the confines of, I want to exist. And for me to exist, I have to exert my existence. And that may take the form of manipulating other people. So it's still a very narcissistic environment.
So I guess what you're saying here is, for me to get that pleasure, I'm thinking narcissistically,
Yeah.
and I'm not thinking of other people. So it's like, okay, I've come to that realization that I have needs for pleasure, but other people also have their needs, and it's about
You're overriding it.
okay, yeah,
And not within the social constraint, because you're not accepting the social constraints and the social rules.
So
you're not accepting the other rules. You're just accepting your own environment, your own narcissistic ego environment.
yeah. So let's take the this might be a stereotypical generalization. So let's take the Muslim experience, right? So you normally have, for most of us, getting, by the time you're married and then you can kind of engage in the sexual relationship, you have had to gone through a lot of cultural expectations, maybe.
Indoctrination, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So mostly people, like maybe if you're in really strong Muslim family who encourage
Yeah.
early marriage, you're looking at 17, 18.
Yeah.
But maybe for most of us, that's 25, 30, maybe, 30 plus.
Yeah, I mean, back home, back home, I'm from Iraq. Within that social structure and that cultural structure, you'd expect to be married by the age of 18, 17 as a male, and probably about 14, 13 as a female, within certain specific social and cultural and religious structures. In the same country, you could be expected to get married after your degree, even within Iraq. That's probably 25, 26, 27. as a male and about 23 as a female. In other structures, so, you always work within a social structure, but the basis of everything is still about pleasure. But then you've realized you've used your intellect in order to override the ego urges, the ego narcissistic urges of manipulation, of power, of positive and negative sexual dynamics between individuals, because you know that this pleasure dynamic is innate, is inevitable, and it's within everything within this physical universe. And some egos are stronger than others. Some egos are more narcissistic than others. I don't know why that is. So within that social framework, it depends on your upbringing, depends on your parents' upbringing, depends on your grandparents' upbringing, depends on your ancestry. Initially, that's your unwritten rule. That's what you work with. That has flaws. Everything has flaws. There isn't one system that works for everyone. We all work from a flawed system. And then it depends on what your relationship is with pleasure. That's the underlying, let's say, argument here. How have you been brought up to have a relationship with pleasure? Is it a positive relationship? Is it a negative relationship? What are the social constraints around pleasure? What is the indoctrination around pleasure? How have you been brought up around the concept of pleasure? That's the essence of sex, essentially. Obviously, then it becomes a loaded issue, because then you have the other social constraints and the other cultural, social issues around it, which also play a factor. Then you have the political. So if you read into your history of sex around these issues, you understand what your relationship is to it.
So you mentioned, you're from Iraq, and you see the disparity between, kind of different social contexts would then have people having an earlier or later sexual debut. How it's about how our perception is with pleasure and how we interact with pleasure, or is it more the thing that the sooner, like almost like the Islamic view, the sooner it is the better, but then people have this confusion of, well, are they mature enough to deal with that pleasure at that time? And how so parents all worry, have they reached that maturity, for example?
I think maturity comes later on. If you give people the basics, then they're able to go to the next level of need. So if you're able to give them that primal need for experiencing sexual pleasure, and that's fulfilled, then they're able to transcend the next level of existence, which is the intellect. So, if you're in a society where pleasure is looked down upon, and, pleasure is not something that's celebrated, or pleasure is something that's judged severely, then, there's no point going to the next level of development, and talk about intellectual endeavors and talk about transcendence with the divine. So one of the reasons why, you know, they do marry from a young age, because they know that this is a very, very powerful drive that needs to be satisfied to the fullness. Otherwise, everything else doesn't work.
Mm.
And, you know, I think we've got things backwards. You know, I think people, you know, get on the transcendence bandwagon a bit too quickly, whereas, you know, the basics haven't been actually ticked off.
So you're saying they're not are you saying they're not mature enough, or they've not grasped the balance between intellect and desire at that point? To
Desire needs to be fulfilled, which happens at a very early age. So they understand that pleasure is there, and then there is the importance of social constraint and cultural constraint,
right, okay.
and society constraint.
So
once they moved on from that, they realized that pleasure can be fulfilled within these parameters and structures. Because, you know, everything has a positive and negative. Now, when you say pleasure, you know, we're not saying have a hedonistic life.
Sure, yeah.
You know, because that doesn't allow you to go to the next step. Fulfilling your pleasures is one thing, but then you still have to grow and progress as a human being. You learn that from a very early age. You know, you learn that delaying gratification is actually a beneficial thing for your human growth.
So I guess what
but the question is, some societies and some indoctrinations tell you that it's all about delaying gratification, where gratification doesn't come in this world, it comes in the next world.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point here. It's brought me back.
Yes, you're back.
Yes, sorry, my lockdown means everyone's on the internet. But I've got a backup, so it's fine. Yeah, so as I was saying,
I did miss, I mean, I missed what you said, you know, about responding to delayed gratification.
Can
you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. So when you're talking about delayed gratification, how, and I was saying in Muslim communities, we have this concept that you can't even talk about gratification, or you can't even talk about pleasure, because sex is a dirty word, isn't it? So I mean,
I think pleasure is a dirty word. I think pleasure is a dirty word, you know, to a certain extent. But because sex is linked with not just, you know, the process of pleasure, but more importantly, the process of vulnerability, which is really powerful. And the image that they want to give to a certain extent is that there is no vulnerability in this world, especially if you follow these certain tenets, then you're not vulnerable anymore. So the reason why sex has a bit of a a taboo issue is because it's probably one of the most vulnerable thing you can ever do as a human being in the physical world. Because it's so intimately related with
Yeah.
vulnerability, and being a newborn, you are essentially vulnerable. So you start realizing that there is a
Yeah.
very close connection between vulnerability and the sexual energy and pleasure. They're all intimately related, which is why when people do have psychological issues, it tends to be related to the vulnerability issues. And it most likely is related to sexual issues. And these don't really develop very well unless you've come out of, the first 7 years of your development, which is why a lot of people bang on about, childhood traumas being one of the major causes for all the psychological traumas. And I guess, being, we're a bit obsessed about sex, being analysts and stuff. We're always talking about, sexual relationships with mother, father, brothers, sisters, incest, all these sort of taboo stuff. But if you delve down into their, into their history and, into their relationship between these areas and their ego and their psyche, and being people that are interested in the psyche, which is your complete self, it tells you about these things through really simple things like your dreams and your fantasies and the things that really attract you in terms of art and music and all of these creative process. And the third sort of triangle of sex is creativity, because that's probably one of the the few acts as human beings, when we are truly in the sexual flow, is being very creative. And it's such an unconscious activity. It's not a conscious activity. When you are having great sex, you are in this kind of flow, unconscious flow, where things are just wonderful. Pleasure, creativity, and vulnerability, and it's an interesting mix.
Yeah, there's definitely Freudian, Oedipus complex, as you're saying, like,
Mate, you've had a boy,
we.
I'm gonna say just watch it, mate. Watch it carefully as an observer, and just you'll be interestedly surprised, how these, how Junior develops, through the years. And yeah, it'll be quite a journey for you, for sure.
Yeah, no. And it is interesting when we're looking at that, looking at early child development and so on, and how, um, as you said, we have these pleasure centers which are natural, and due to socialization, they're almost, if we repress them or if we even deny them, then that's perhaps where some of the shadowy type
Yeah. So,
transferences come
yeah, I
from.
mean, exactly, about shadow from a psychoanalytical point of view, a shadow, in a sense, is part of the conscious and the unconscious. So it's got its feet in both worlds. So whatever we don't like, whatever we repress, or whatever we consider to be evil or not right or horrible or just not the right way, we push it into the shadow. And then they become underdeveloped. They become what we call a secondary function. So you have a primary function, which is, you could, talking simply, you could be an extrovert. So you gain your energy from the external world. If the external world is happy, you gain that energy from the external world and you become happy yourself.
Mm,
Now that's a
mm,
primary function because it works for you. The opposite of that is introversion, where you gain your energy from your insides. Now you push that into the shadow because it's underdeveloped.
mm,
Now that's on a conscious level. So this is a conscious part of your shadow. Then you have the unconscious part of the shadow, which exerts itself in ways we don't like. And the
mm,
easiest way of explaining that is when someone triggers you, or when you hate someone, or you hate a thing, or it just really gets on your, I mean, I use this term all the time, gets on your tits.
mm.
You're just not happy about it. Now that's a shadow projection onto you, and you project it onto the thing or the person or the ideology or the way of life or the color or the social strata or the language or whatever.
Mhm, mhm,
And really what I understand from this is that we have to find ways of integrating your shadow into your consciousness, because that way you make yourself a bigger person, a better person, a more resilient person, a more person of iman, a more person of substance, a
mm,
person that can experience life more richly by incorporating what your secondary function is consciously, or what the shadow is projecting through you onto other people.
I think that's really well put, that um, as you mentioned, that things which are underdeveloped are actually shadows. It's not the fact that they may, if they had time to be properly developed, and we kind of accepted them. So and I guess part of the shadow is running away from it, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
Or
I'll give you an
not
example.
addressing
I
it.
mean, language, for example. I've always run away from language, particularly the French
Mm,
language, because I had a particular experience and I didn't like it, and I was a total failure and it was horrible. So I ran away from the French language and the French culture and just the French way of life. And then for one reason or another, I had an epiphany, and I think I saw a dream about speaking French. I thought to myself, that's something I got to work on.
mm, mm.
And now that I'm learning a bit of French, I'm not very good, but je suis parle français un peu, something's there.
Très bien.
It's très bien. Yeah,
Yeah.
d'accord. So I'm enriching myself, and then I start realizing that there were other issues around running away from the French language that I can also look
Mm,
back on and see where my projections are, because that's what we have to do. We have to take back our negative projections and work on them, because what we do most of the time, when
mm,
we're
mm,
in distress or upset, or it's not working out for us, or something's not going right for us, it's that shadow projection that we have to take
mm.
back and work on ourselves.
And I think and for clients or people with um, say any issues. So I mean, we deal with same-sex lust, for example, but it could be any issue of kind of bringing that forward. And we always kind of say that actually we encourage coming out. We encourage people to come out and say, I'm struggling with this, rather than having it as a shadow. And
Yeah,
because it's not really accepted in the community to say, um, I'm sexually frustrated.
yeah, yeah,
Even that word is not really acceptable to say in the community. Um, if we embrace that, and then we kind of came to the conclusion, and it's interesting because in my journey, we use the term same-sex attraction, for example, and then you're like, okay, I'm trying to get away from the same-sex attraction, but actually, as Rogers says, it's like, unless only when I embrace what I am, then I can change. So it's almost like only when I can say, I see my shadow, I accept my shadow for it is, and that's when the shadow goes down, because you're accepting what it is. So it's almost like it's a way of life coming back and saying you have something to deal with, you're running away from it, and you just need to go and accept it and say, this is my truth, or this is what's happening to me at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, your shadow doesn't disappear. It doesn't go anywhere. It'll always be there. You'll always have a shadow. You'll always have a conscious shadow, because there's always something conscious that we have to work on. We'll never reach that stage of total consciousness. So you'll always have a conscious shadow chasing you. And we all run away from all sorts of things. There's not a single human being out there who's not running away from their shadow. We're all running away from our shadow. There's always things to work on there. I mean, the scary thing is you have an unconscious shadow, which you don't know what lurks in there. And I'm not saying it's evil, but it's undesirable to your current conscious persona. So you have a persona which is created by society and by yourself, by your ego, in order to exert whatever it is that you exert in society. We have multiple personas for multiple situations. Once you remove all of those personas away, you're left with the ego, but that ego is still attached to the shadow. So this is all within the conscious realm. Now the psyche, which is, a kind of pseudo-scientific name for the soul, that brings it all together. And in my estimation, if you are going through some serious psychological problems, whether it's psychosis or severe delusional states, that's the psyche telling you something really important. And your conscious ego has ruptured, and it can't keep reality from disreality. And you're hearing these flow of energy. Now, the psyche talk to us through these inspirations, or through these aha moments, or simply through dreams, or simply through there are certain things in life where we go, oh my God, this is saying something to me. And you've got to listen to it. Now, you won't know the answer straight away. It may take you years to know the answers of what it means. But this is where, the art of symbolism comes in. And, as you know, symbols are not like signs. Signs are quite clear to read, and they have to be clear. Otherwise, it's not doing its job. Whereas a symbol needs a lot of interpretation. And I think, there's a lot of scope for interpretation within the Islamic tradition. There's a lot of symbols there, and, you rightly talked about cultivation being really important within relationships between males and females, within a marriage structure. And cultivation sometimes works. You get great harvest, and sometimes you get no harvest. And sometimes certain seeds work and other seeds don't. And certain structures work and it doesn't, but it means that it takes a lot of effort to cultivate a relationship like this. And, are we in a society where we're not given enough time to cultivate these things? So cultivation is really important. So coming back, symbolism is really important. Symbolism is sort of in essence, one of the it is the way that the psyche, which is connected to the divine, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the ruh is min amr rabbi,
Mm.
this is the divine touch. And it the thing about the psyche, it's not like the ego. It is sort of, it has the wisdom of the past, it has the flow of the present, and the potential of the future. So it's connected to the past, present, and future.
Yeah. No, I've seen the psychoanalytical terms, and I've always wondered, like, ego, is that nafs? Is that how we
Could
say
be.
nafs? And then, like you say, psyche, is that ruh? Is it the spirit? Is it the soul? And it's interesting because obviously the Quran talks about dreams and inspiration from dreams and how we're getting those messages, and even nightmares in a sense as well. If there's, as you mentioned, there's a rupture between the two, and we're kind of
I mean, I wouldn't
struggling.
call them nightmares at all. I mean, I'd call them really, really important, insightful messages and symbols that's definitely worth delving into, particularly recurrent ones. I get really excited when I hear that someone's having a recurrent nightmare.
Would you say that's would you say it's something that their subconscious is struggling with? Would you say it's they're not
No, the
addressing?
ego's struggling with it. Their ego is just like putting a stop to it.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. That's why it's a nightmare.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the psyche always wins. Unless you actually stop this life. So, if you do kill yourself, that's your strong ego stopping the life experience.
So it's almost like there's this, as you mentioned, the ego being like this logical, conscious kind of thing, and
if it works for its existence. So for it to exert its existence on you, it will logically tell you to kill itself, and it will find all the logical ways to do that if it knows that's how it's going to affect you, or
right.
it's going to have an influence on you.
Yeah.
It
Interesting.
uses all kinds of ways of wanting to exert what it wants, and then it develops very strong personas. So it will use a very strong society persona, saying that sex is bad for you, or it's not part of Iman, or it's not it's not the image that a religious person should have, and use that very powerfully in order to maintain a social construct which has worked for you for decades.
And I think that's really interesting, and that's what one of the things I'd like to touch upon is the in our culture or Muslim culture, the attitudes we have towards this. And we have the famous tradition from the Prophet when he's informed about monasticism, and he says, no, that's not, I eat meat, I have relationships. He even says that one of the highest pleasures in this world is sex. Is a tradition which clearly says that, as you mentioned, from a psychoanalytical point of view as well. But there always seems to be, and I don't know if it's just me or people coming from a religious background, there seems to be like, okay, now you're married, and then suddenly it's like everything's halal, and then for maybe for the ego, it's like, oh, what's happened here? I've been trying to control the psyche all along, and now suddenly, it's acceptable. And I think even in a marriage, and inshallah we'll get to questions, because I know people have been asking questions around difficulties in that, is where do you kind of, is the community really ready to go to a counselor or an imam for sexual difficulties or issues in sex, when it's, as you mentioned, it's such a it's a developmental thing. It's not something you can just ignore. We're born with that, and
Yeah.
you know.
No, I mean, I totally agree with you.
And
And I think, you know, groups like yourself, these kind of discussions are really important. And, you know, we need to open the floodgates, so to speak. And you will experience a deluge of all kinds of mixed emotions and energies coming out, but it's inevitable. It's inevitable within a community that they need to move forward from the past, all within a cultural and religious context. I think that's really important, and that's probably one of the reasons why people are reluctant. You know, there are services out there, but it's culturally irrelevant, religiously irrelevant, and it doesn't talk to the basis of how we grew up and what are the roots that were given to us, and we've got to work with these roots. You know, you can't extract these roots from how we were not just brought up, but our ancestry, because that has a massive effect on our psychology. You know, genetically speaking, we are given a set of genes, and we can't change that. You know, these genes can become activated, disactivated, upregulated, downregulated, but it's still within that cultural and that religious context. Otherwise, you do create a lot of confusion, and you do create a lot of dissonance. And you know, I mean, this is something that they're seeing within the Western world in terms of gender dysphoria, which, you know, which isn't an old phenomenon. It's been around for over 100 years. And it was mainly, you know, amongst males going through gender dysphoria, but because of social media confusion and you know, the intrusion of technology within the psychology of the human beings, it sort of turned into a sort of a female teenager thing. So that all has consequences, and devastating consequences if they go down the sort of medical route of sex changes and so on. So coming back to your question, it's essential that we have people who are versed both in the you know, the cultural and religious aspect, and also have some idea about the psychological aspect as well. And I think, you know, with all, you know, so much information out there, because people are exposed to a lot of information, and when you have a lot of choices, it gets very confusing.
Yeah,
And
Thomas.
secondly, you know, you are talking about a society, and a society is made up of a nucleus of groups and individuals, and family structures. And family structures, you know, do work. Family structures are successful. You know, the reason why society works is because of, you know, the macrocosm works because of the microcosm. And then the
I think,
families,
yeah.
and then the family structure works is because you have an inner cosm, which is also congruent with your own society and your own internal cosmos.
Yeah, I mean, the family structure, like say with Islam, the mother and the father, and the role for that, you know, what West would maybe call monogamous, you know, kind of the monogamous relationship, kind of builds
It's
that
worked for
family
centuries.
unit. Yeah.
It's worked for centuries, and there's no reason why it can't go on for another, you know, 2, 3, 4,000 years. And, you know, these, you know, talking from a psychoanalytical point of view, you know, these ancient wisdoms have been put in there for a reason, because it works. And it's allowed us to survive in really difficult situations. You know, 200 years ago, it was really difficult to sort of reach the age of 40 and 50. So these structures work. But I think, you know, now that we're in a sort of much more open society where people do question a lot of these things, and they're entitled to question them, and they're entitled to have different views. and people are allowed to go away and sort of do other things. Whether they work or not, only time will tell. But I'm sticking with what works. It's worked in the past, and I'm not going to change anytime soon.
Well, I think in light of these questionings, I think it'd be good to look at some of the questions which are
We can go on,
coming
right?
up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it is really interesting having, and really as you've shown the similarities between the psychoanalytical and almost the Islamic understanding, and really the cultural aspect, which might be intergenerational, which comes in and kind of confuses things for a lot of us, when we kind of shy away from, as you mentioned, something which is so intimate for us. And we're so vulnerable in that moment that it's not something we can easily discuss, which is understandable. But at the same time, we had the discussion on shadow. If we do have shadow and we run away from it, it only gets bigger, and we're not addressing it. So in terms of the Q&A, you can just be noted that this is a live public webinar. So you can be anonymous if you do wish to be anonymous. There is also opportunity to raise hand if someone wants to ask a question via audio. That's possible as well. So in terms of I'm going to look at the chat first. So I know people have been using the chat as well, but if you want, we'll go through that one as well. So the first question, which has come out, if there's no any audio questions, people want to go raise their hand up, is how does one struggle with their sexual identity?
That's a very good question. And I mean, is this something that's sort of new or sort of an old issue, in the sense that, is it gender dysphoria from childhood, or is it sort of recent? So that's the first issue to sort of look into. And then obviously what your sexual development is growing up as a child. That will have a massive impact on your sexual identity and what it means to define sexuality within you. But there is a biological and then there is a social construct, and I think people confuse the two. So the sexuality, biologically speaking, is non-ambiguous for 99.99% of people. Obviously, there are individuals who have both sex organs and both sex reproductive parts, called hermaphrodites, and there are some people who have no sex organs as well. But I don't know what the stats are. I think it's about 1 in 100,000, 1 in 200,000. So that's on a biological level. After that, then it depends on your upbringing. So it depends on your social strata, social network, your ideological upbringing, and then where are you in your development? Are you a child? Are you a teenager? Are you an activist, non-activist? Are you east, west? Are you on the left side, the right side? All of that has influences on how you identify yourself as sexually.
So I think the questioners just raised their hands. I'm just going to bring them in. Assalamu alaikum. Brother, would you like to expand maybe a bit more about
Yeah,
the
definitely. Salam alaikum to the doctor and to you, Ali.
Salam, salam Zulfiqar.
What I want to know is the first question, because you mentioned like people struggling with their identity. That was just sort of a foray. I thought I would ask, how does actually one struggle with it? Because I haven't dealt with people that have had these struggles, but in case something like I thought this was what the discussion was going to be centered about. But when you got into the other discussions, it turned out very interesting for me. So what I want to know is from your experience in these kind of issues is like, for example, young people going through like higher sexual drive, not even higher sexual drive, just for example, a lot of young Muslims now, they're like watching a lot of porn, masturbation, all that type of thing. And they try to like get religious advice from the sheikhs or whatever. How do you stop doing it? Like how do I control my sexual desire? I wanted to ask, because so one of the sheikhs in a lecture said that you can't control your sexual desire. It's as bad as like, not bad, so it's as strong as wanting to eat food or, for example, drink water or go to the toilet or whatever. So it's like something that has to be fulfilled. But how is a young person in the West supposed to like control their sexual desire from around about the time they start exploring at maybe 12, 13, and then up to like 25 when they get married? That's one thing, because obviously masturbation is a sin and there's fornication as well. And a lot of young people, unfortunately, in the West, they get involved in that. The other thing is recently, I've been thinking about Islamic sources. Where in Islamic sources does it talk about actual sex, like between a man and a woman, and how that should be carried out? And also, more importantly, the relationships they should have between them, how they can solve the issues between them in terms of sexual energy. So I was recently reading a book about preserving sexual energy by Mantak Chia, and he talks about celibacy, and he talks about transmutation of sexual energy, so that you don't. So, for example, for semen retention or celibacy, so that obviously as a young person that's unmarried, that's probably a good thing, because if it's giving you some techniques into celibacy and semen retention, that's probably a good thing up until you get married. So I wanted to know about transmutation of sexual energy, if that's an actual thing, whether or not the sexual desire is actually as strong as eating, like the Sheikh said, and also spiritually speaking, any resources or references around sex and gender relationships within Islam, spiritually speaking. So you mentioned a little about the psyche, so just like tying that into it as well. Sorry, I know it's a bit of a loaded question, but it's very interesting.
Too many questions, Zulfiqar. What are you talking about? Too many.
Too many, yeah.
Too many. Okay. Well, the answer to the first question.
Can I drop you a message like when
the answer to the first question, the answer to it is you can't control it. So I totally agree with the Imam, and it is probably the most powerful energy that needs to be fulfilled or released or transmuted.
All right.
Okay, so that's the first thing. I'm not an Islamic scholar, so I don't know anything about the scriptures and sort of what's in there. But physiologically speaking, the more ejaculations that you do, the less powerful they become.
Yeah.
And the more you see your pleasure centers, which is found in the hypothalamus, and it transmits a lot of dopamine to your prefrontal cortex. You've got a pathway there, and if you keep using that pathway, it gets run down.
The reward cycle is messed up.
Yeah, you get potholes everywhere. It's a bit like the A41 down in the North Circular. You get a lot of potholes there, and it does run down. So to a certain extent, having some form of regulation.
But then how is that possible for example, they say, in the West, you don't get married till at 25. So what, how is a young person supposed to protect himself Islamically?
Well, find ways in which you think works with your cultural and religious context.
Okay.
That doesn't damage you psychologically, because a lot of people get into this kind of thing of conflict. They have an internal conflict, and that's the worst thing you can be in, is being this internal conflict of am I doing it halal? Is it not halal? Is this right? Isn't it right? So it's really important to actually resolve these issues.
Right.
And this is where experts in your society, in your religion, and medical experts can come together and come up with a consensus that solves your issues and solves your conflict.
It's not a simple answer, get married. It's not. You're not saying
it's not as simple as answer as that. No, absolutely not. Because marriage, I mean, when I got married 20 years ago, it's different from getting married now. Totally different world and totally different ball game. You know, it's like buying a car, you know, or having a car. You know, a car of 20 years ago is different from a car of now. You know, getting a mortgage is totally different. So, you know, it is a kind of, you know, you're telling 13, 14, 15-year-olds to go and get a 50-year mortgage on a property that you can't afford. So there are other ways of finding shelter, and you know, well, you know, what works for you. I mean, if pornography works for you, great.
But that, you know, obviously, you know that masturbation is not allowed within Islam.
According to who? You know, some ulama say it's absolutely fine.
Oh, really? I didn't. Within Shia ulama.
Yes.
Can you give me a name, because I've never heard of
it. Yes, I can send you a name. I'll send it to. You see, they use language. It's all about language here, and it's really important to use language in the appropriate way. Now, the language that they use, they say, if you're unable to do it like this, you can do it like this. If you're unable to do it like this, you can do it like this. So there is a de-escalation of language. And I think it's really important that we de-escalate the language that we use in essential areas like this, rather than escalating the language.
Yeah, that's quite.
You know, words are very powerful. And I think particularly now in these days, where everything is politically correct, I think we need to use fairly good de-escalating language when it comes to sensitive issues like this. And, you know, there are some ulama who use de-escalating language in order to solve these issues. And these, you know, they're not major issues per se, but for some of our struggling brothers and sisters, yeah, which is why, you know, the brother's all quiet now. You know, he's thinking, ching, ching, ching.
No, I'm just thinking.
So this is so like so superior. This is like obviously like.
See, he's excited now. Zulfikar is excited now. He's on cloud 9.
I'm actually perplexed because obviously I follow Saitistani, which is what most Shias follow, and it clearly says on his website, you can look at his laws, masturbation is not allowed.
Well, you know, if that's the case, he needs to put systems in place. He personally needs to put systems in place because he's using a certain language in order to allow you to fulfill your base needs. And, you know, certain ulama haven't fulfilled base needs for their own societies.
Yeah, I think, you know, it goes back to saying, what's my faith and values? If my faith and values are in, say, I'm struggling with pornography, I'm struggling with acting out sexually, and the masturbation is then helping me side that off, or otherwise I would just commit that, then we have in Islam the lesser of two evils, for example, that then you take as a path. So when you say something's categorically haram, well, you have to then see the context of whether you're going and doing a greater haram in that scenario. So yes, you know, like the traditional Islamic viewpoint would be, as much as you can have it in a halal relationship, and for whatever reason people find today that they cannot be in a halal relationship, say people with any type of sexual issues, SSA or whatever we're saying, then we're saying, okay, let's, while we're going towards hopefully inshallah a halal relationship, in the meantime, this is what we can, you know, so for masturbation, for example, if that prevents you from doing further harm, and you know, you can always discuss that with the marja and then clarify, if I'm already struggling with pornography, excessive, you know, sexual issues, then in this context, can I, you know?
Well, the thing is, this is a very common thing because a lot of young people have already gone to like Saitistani, they're one of the most famous ones. They've gone and asked him, you know, in like, for example, I'm not married, I have financial issues, I can't marry at the moment. Like, you know, what do you suggest? say you can't masturbate, it's haram. I mean, they won't give you like, for example, any scale of like a sliding scale, or you can do this much or that much. You know, it just doesn't. That's why when I was asking, that's why when I'm so shocked. I'm not perplexed or excited. I'm just shocked that, you know, Dr. Haitham, you're saying that. To get clarification again on your point, are you saying that you believe that it's okay for young Muslim men and women to masturbate?
You see, I'm not a marja.
But
But if I was a marja, then I would say absolutely fine. Absolutely.
Hmm.
You know, from a psychological perspective, from a physical perspective, from a physiological perspective, absolutely normal.
So think from the Islamic lens, it goes into, okay, if I'm having a masturbation in itself isn't haram if you're doing sex with someone who's doing it. Is it going to be a one experience just for myself, for my own pleasure, or is it going to be a shared experience which I'm sharing with someone else? Again, you know, what we say is you go back to your belief values, and if you say, okay, if I want to be moving to God centricity and not self-centricity, then I'm sharing that experience with someone else. When you can't do that, because as what we've just discussed, and it prevents you from going to further haram, then that.
Okay, fine. So I've understood that. And the last point was about transmutation. If you can just talk about that, and then the sexual energy between men and women, and how I can know more about, understand that a little bit more.
So is this celibacy? Is that what you're saying? Is celibacy?
No. So the other point was about transmutation of sexual energy. So that's whether that's actually a thing, or whether or not it's as effective. Like, for example, transmutation meaning you could be getting into very creative things like meditation or writing, or, for example,
does that work for you, Zulfiqar? I mean, is it sort of?
I haven't. To be honest, it's not a matter of whether it's working for me or not. I'm not talking about myself. I'm just putting it out there that I've been reading about transmutation of sexual energy very recently by Mantak Chia. I don't know if you've heard of the author. He talks about the Taoist idea is to preserve sexual energy so that you're empowered, so that in a very like spiritual sense. So it delves into spirituality quite a lot, mysticism.
I mean, how many of these people actually follow this way of life and thinking, in your opinion?
The people that follow the Taoist way of life.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there'll be probably a substantial amount of people in Asia. You know, that's where it originated, I guess.
I mean, any kind of abstinence does actually work. Abstinence works in general, but there's a price to pay. There's always a price to pay.
Right.
So the price to pay is that you won't be experiencing the sexual energy. You'll be experiencing the transmutation to some other energy, whatever it is that, you know, be closeness to God.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, there is transfers of energy from one form to another, for sure. But then, you know, why is this an issue for people who want to transmutate? Because they have this perception that this is a draining energy rather than a uplifting energy.
Yeah, well, they think if you preserve it, then it's beneficial spiritually. So
that's their perception. But for other people,
I've read a lot around scholars and mysticism, and they've said that, for example, not completely abstinent in celibacy like the monks did. I mean, they went crazy. Well, you can see with the Christian world, and I don't want to point any fingers, but the point I'm making is that reduced, for example, fasting, when you reduce food, when you reduce sexual intimacy with your woman, then those things, obviously, it's like a vital energy, right? So when you preserve it, that does good things for your glands, for your brain, for your heart, and also speaking. I don't know if that is anything that you've heard of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it works, and I think it's a good practice. You know, I personally do this practice, but that's more to do with you know, relationship constraints rather than anything else. It's called life, mate. It's called life. You can't get what you want all the time.
No worries. I've taken it over. I'll stop there with all my questions. But thanks so much.
Thank you for being quite open and honest,
Yeah, no
Zulfikar.
problem.
We've got another person, Mohammed Ibrahim, if they would like to talk. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, I just want to back up what Brother Zulfikar is researching to do with the Mantak Chia approach. There is actually a book. I mean, he's written several books. His early books are actually quite technical. His later book, which is The Multi-Orgasmic Male, which he did with, I think, Michael Wynn, is actually quite good. I had a lot of struggle. I mean, I was very, very interested that Dr. Haidar would be giving this talk, because in my personal life, I've had a lot of struggle around the whole idea of sex and sexual feelings, etc., because my childhood was very, very repressive. And then, of course, I come into Islam and I find, the Muslims are not too happy about sex either, at least not nowadays. They're not. So I've had to go on my own journey, and part of that was reading the books of Wilhelm Reich, who was, of course, a student of Sigmund Freud, and then part of it was reading the books of Mantak Chia. And actually, I say that I'm a Taoist, but actually I'm a half-trained Taoist. I haven't taken the full training, honestly. Otherwise, I'd be a Chinese medicine practitioner. But yeah, I mean, what I found in my own practice of the Mantak Chia's methods is that, strangely enough, as you learn to kind of transmute the energy through, shall we say, doing different sexual practices, it's masturbation basically, but it's a more complicated, evolved type where you don't ejaculate. Yeah, I've noticed transmutation is real. It happens, and you can use that energy for creativity. It's not through repressing, because a lot of people, like from the like Victorian era, I think we got all of this crap from the Victorians, to be honest. They were all about repressing sexual energy. But actually, if you can transmute, and then you can actually use that energy to become more creative, and then you don't have that blockage, which Wilhelm Reich talked about. He called that stasis, when you're like blocked and you can't really do anything. So I mean, I don't identify exactly with any particular school of thought. I know that a lot of scholars say masturbation is haram. Personally, and this is very much to do with my own research, I don't take that view, although I do hold the Taoist perspective that if you ejaculate a lot, that's unhealthy. So I just wanted to back up what Brother Zulfikar said, and to basically put my own personal rubber stamp of approval on the works of Mantak Chia as a possible alternative to masturbation. So yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you so much for sharing and giving that insight, Brother Brian. Thanks for that, and hopefully Brother Zulfikar finds, and audience finds that useful. And it's an interesting discussion, I guess, on retention and kind of that. So hopefully that's been fruitful. I've got and I know this. I want to go on this question because I know this brother's been waiting for a while. He wants to ask everything about testosterone. So reasons for low testosterone, whether it has an effect on masculinity, how can we boost testosterone naturally? So don't know what your thoughts are, Dr. Haidar.
Yeah, natural boosters are sleep is a natural booster. Heavy exercise, so heavy weights is a natural booster. Meat, so good quality meat is a natural booster. Reducing stress, it's sort of all these good and wonderful things, and reducing sex as well, because we do release a lot of testosterone, and there's only so much testosterone we can produce. So if we save it up, it does actually accumulate within the organs. And for some reason fasting as well. So things like intermittent fasting does actually help.
There's a question on that. Is provide clarity on dopamine detox. So would fasting help with on?
Yes, I mean, pleasure detox does actually help as well. So we talked about delaying gratification and delaying pleasure being a way of actually improving your life in general, and also increasing your neurotransmitters within the nervous system. So reducing the things that give you pleasure, could be mobile phones, checking Facebook, watching your favorite soap or series, or watching Ali on the Facebook group. That may release a lot of dopamine. So not coming on every month and watching him. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, having dopamine detoxes does help. And fasting does help for sure. I think, fasting is a very good way of improving one's health. Obviously not sort of chronic fasting where you're
Repressing it.
Yeah, but intermittent fasting, where you fast, say, for 2 or 3 days a month, I think that's a good way. And that also involves no sex or no masturbation or no porn, or just to sort of reset the system. Definitely works.
Great. Got a question on low sex drive and not having erections, and kind of like someone finds themselves in that case, what's
So you need to separate the sort of physical from the psychological. So it's important to make sure that your physical health is normal. So it may be worth getting some blood tests and hormonal tests to make sure that's all okay. That's the first thing to do. And then secondly, sort of psychological well-being. Stress is the biggest cause for premature ejaculation. Generally speaking, age is the commonest cause of premature ejaculation. So we naturally go down that path for all of us. It is.
Look forward to them.
Yeah, probably already there, maybe. Yeah, probably already there. Yeah, already fucked kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, making sure that you're physically healthy, and if you're not, sort of addressing that, and then looking at your sort of psychological health and addressing that as well.
Right. Okay. I'm just gonna pick another question. There's a lot of questions on, and I know this was going to come up on symbolism and penis size, and this is quite psychoanalytical, isn't it?
I mean, penises symbolize essentially prosperity and growth and the good stuff in life. The bigger the minaret, the bigger the penis, the more success in society. So there is a connection between minarets and penises, so that the bigger your minaret, the more prosperous your society will be. And before particularly in Roman times, they used to have monuments and what's the word, we've got sort of the green eye, the blue eye. Back in those days, they had the penises, so it warded off bad omens and bad luck, and it brought in more customers and more of the cash. So it's good to have them around. And psychoanalytically speaking, they talk about penis envy in teenage girls, that they realize that they don't have a penis, and they get very neurotic about it, and some of them want to go down the gender change route. So there is this big concept of penis envy, and But yeah, I mean, it's also a very important delicacy in some of the Mediterranean countries. You know, it's like the olden days of eating caviar. So yeah, it's a big deal.
I don't know if it'd be caviar for me for that. Yes.
Yeah, it's great stuff, mate.
Yeah, the thing one Sayed has asked a question. Is LGBT a disease like mental disorder, or is it natural or fashion? I don't know what that is. If it is mental disorder, then what are the solutions? If it's natural, then why religion prohibit? If there's an example of the light of Quran in Islam, or what is punishment? I can quickly answer that. So
Yes.
we don't say LGBT is a mental disorder. We say that people experience different attractions, and they experience different emotions. And just to also answer, I think Zulfikar's point earlier on sexual identity, the concept of straight and gay, homosexual, heterosexual only came in the 1900s. So this whole concept of labeling my sexual identity based on attractions is a very new type of concept. So in terms of Islam, Islam looks at an attraction which is outside marriage as, something which is problematic. It doesn't really, yes, so in terms of if I'm attracted to the same sex, then I have to see how I can go in that attraction and see what's behind that attraction and do work for that. In terms of punishments, there's only punishments if something's haram. Now, if I'm feeling those attractions, that isn't haram because those are involuntary attractions. If I then go and act upon those attractions in a way that then puts me outside of the fold of Islam, then obviously that's something which I arguably had some type of control over, and then that's where you can kind of go in. So I think it's very important to kind of distinguish the two. So I don't know if Dr. Haidar wants to add anything more, or if he's happy.
Well, this whole concept around mental disorder, 100 years ago, I think there were 3 mental illness diagnoses, and then it went to about 50 back in 1940s, and now we've got 600 different mental disorders and illnesses. And I think back in 1960, masturbation was a mental disorder. So, it's not really a hard and fast rule that, the classification of mental disorder is actually science. It's really political and sociological and economical. Does it make socio-political economic sense to put certain categories within the mental illness criteria and not?
And we see that with the DSM, isn't it? So
the DSM and the ICD, these are 2 categories. Restlessness within young boys. That was something that was common in my day. Now you've got ADHD, and now, whereas before it was a childlike state, now if you have it in adulthood, you've got adult onset ADHD. And sort of, why do they have these things? They have these things in order for you to go within the system and be medicated. And then once you're medicated, you're pretty much, what's the word? In trouble. Going back to the question, it says here, please let me know how to overcome SSA in normal layman terms from your experience as a doctor. And I presume you mean I thought you meant serotonin. Right, yes.
Sorry, yeah.
SSRIs, yeah. I mean, once you're within the medical system, particularly when it comes to mental health, it's pretty difficult to get out. You need to wake up and find a way of getting out of that system. And it's only going to become, it's getting more and more invasive and intrusive in normal people's lives. And, you know, we all go through difficulty and distress and discomfort psychologically, and it's absolutely normal. But now it's become a medical diagnosis.
We've got, I know I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to take a few more questions. We've got a question saying, why after watching pornography, we feel like we feel depressed and have anxiety and our psyche becomes unstable? How to overcome this if we have already seen it?
Well, you can't overcome it because that's your normal reaction to having that high, and then after a high you get a low, you know. So it's a bit like injecting yourself with heroin, you know. If that's your reaction to it, then I would seriously think about not watching it. But it's difficult because it's available everywhere, and I think it's worth speaking to someone about it and see what the initial reasons are. What gets you into those situations, and then but it's naturally physiological. So, you know, your what they call sympathetic hormones kick in, so you get a great high, and your body has to calm yourself down quickly afterwards, otherwise you are vulnerable to all kinds of bad things. So it's only natural that you get this depression. Anxiety, I don't know why I get anxiety, you know, that's sort of more psychological issues that need to be looked at. But, you know, it's great that you've recognized that this happens to you. And, you know, maybe it's a time for you to sort of look into it and possibly change.
Yeah, I think definitely there's the halal need, which we say people, you know, if pornography is something which is then upsetting, we're saying, okay, why am I going there and I'm looking in the first place? Am I not meeting that need? You know, because there's a halal need to have that sexual energy and experience that. If that's not being, if that's not possible, then how do I deal with that energy in a way which is more consistent with myself, so I don't become depressed and anxiety when I'm, you know, through that feeling. So hopefully that helps. There's quite a few questions, but maybe just I'll pick the one where it's we talked about celebrating pleasure. I guess it kind of comes all of these questions in terms of what does good sex and sexuality then look like if we are, you know, we're not repressing it, and in the Muslim kind of socio-cultural
I mean,
context.
yeah, I mean, if it speaks to you socially, Islamically, psychologically, economically, within a relationship as well, if it ticks all those boxes and it's pleasurable and you're giving pleasure to the other person, if it ticks all those boxes, then that's a great sexual experience. So I guess it's hard to get tick all the boxes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it happens. It happens. I think, you know, it tends to happen earlier in relationships because you're kind of making sure you put the effort in and there's less distractions. But once you have kids and a mortgage and a profession and other personality and persona stratas, it becomes less of a sexual experience and more of a chore. So if it ticks all the boxes, then that's a great experience.
And I think perhaps because we're in a society which almost is only focused on the physical aspect of sex and not the emotional aspect, which, you know, which is like gives us security, gives us comfort, gives us a sense of belonging, or, you
cultivation, togetherness, clothing each other in spirit. So you know, I mean, you know, the Quran talks about libas, which is a very intimate garment,
Mm.
you know. And garments are very, and you know, libas in Iraqi means pants for the man and knickers for the woman. So you know, it is, and they've got to be comfortable, super comfortable. You know, you're not going to wear something that doesn't fit perfectly.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. That's a revelation for me. The libas being pants. So yeah.
Yeah.
Very
Because when we're
very
young, it's
close.
all about, are you putting your pants on? Is it clean? Is it so? That's all they talk about when we're younger, and it shows you the significance of that. You know,
Mm,
the significance of how important it is for these, you know, genitalia to be in such pristine condition,
in
waiting to
such
be,
perfection.
yeah, waiting to be put into action.
Interaction. Yeah. Waiting. No. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think on this discussion, there's there's so much. I think there's 8 or so questions there, and we don't run out of time. But I think, as Brother Zulfikar at the start stated, there's and as Dr. Haidar mentioned, it's like opening the floodgates on this, because I think avenues where we can just have an honest conversation on, not even, I like how we started with just looking at the body need, let alone socialization, culture, religious context. What what is my body actually doing? Like we say, once counseling or therapy leads you to a place of self-awareness. So if I'm in a state where I'm in a better know how I am, how I react to things, only then I can make an informed decision, rather than just saying, oh, because the scholar tells me this, I need to do that, without actually seeing what's going on within, and what's, what our body is saying. And I think it's that marrying between the ego and the psyche that we then discussed, of how we rationalize that, and how we use sexuality or sex in an intellectual way, where we're not just confining it to unlimited bound pleasure or extreme repression, and we're finding that bit in between, where we're physically, emotionally, spiritually fulfilling it, and we're not just kind of shying around it, or not bringing it into the forefront.
Yeah, it's a work in progress. I mean, these are all issues that, I never talked about in my lifetime, really. And it's only after I've been exposed to these, psychosocial concepts that you realize that there's a whole body of work that needs working on. So it's important that we do continue this work, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I know you cover a lot of these themes on your, or some of these themes of health and so on your podcast. Would you like to talk a little bit about that before we maybe end?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, because I went through a lot of psychological difficulty, and the thing that helped me get out of it is actually listening to different perspectives. And I did that by listening to other people's podcasts, and I realized that it gave me a lot of benefit in my own psychological conflict. And then I saw a coach, and then they thought that I was a good listener and a good coach myself. And then I went down that route, down the route of coaching before I became a psychoanalyst. And yeah, I started my podcast in 2018. Surgical Spirit is called, the Surgical Spirit podcast. And I've got you on it, and I think you'll be out. Your episode will be out in a couple of weeks' time, and that was a really interesting discussion that we had together. And it's about opening your perspective and changing your perspective, and looking outside with a different lens, and that allows you to look within with a different lens, and see all the shadow areas and all of the dark areas which haven't been shone at, so to speak. So yeah, it's definitely a work in progress, and yeah, conversations are really important. I think conversations are essential for our development.
Inshallah. Well, thank you for shining a light with us today on some of these dark, shadowy issues which people run away from. How can people contact you and get more in touch with you if they have further questions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm active on LinkedIn, so Dr. Haidar Al-Hakim. My website is drhaidaralhakim.com. I used to be called the Third Eye Doctor, so on Twitter and on Instagram, I'm called the Third Eye Doctor, because I'm an ophthalmologist as well.
MashaAllah.
Hence the pun.
Mm.
So yeah, come along and enjoy the journey.
Brilliant. Well, no, thank you so much, Dr. Haidar, for your time and really discussing being courageous, I would say, in the Muslim community to talk about perhaps a taboo topic, and kind of giving it the psychoanalytical as well as the religious context need that it deserves. And we're very grateful to have you on, and inshallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect you and protect the work that you're doing, inshallah ta'ala.
Well, thank you for the courage. I think that's what brought me towards you, is seeing you come out, and you being the courageous one. So you inspired me to actually talk about these things.
No, inshallah. Well, thanks. It's by people like yourselves who can then bridge conversations, inshallah. I know you're London based, but inshallah we
yeah, after lockdown we'll
north, then inshallah
inshallah
meet takes things further. And yeah, just like to thank everyone who is attending, and inshallah our next we have our next webinar, inshallah, planned for next month. We're discussing different approaches in therapy with SSA. We're actually taking psychoanalytical perspective as well. So we're looking at EMDR, we're looking at what's known as reintegrative therapy. And we're joined by David Pickup, who is a psychotherapist in the US, who's joining us. So watch out for that, inshallah, for our next webinar. And I'd like to thank Dr. Haidar and all of our members who've joined and participated. And inshallah, until next time, Assalamu alaikum.